What if everything you know about Medusa is backwards? What if she wasn't a victim of the gods, but a weapon of the Titans? What if the woman with snakes for hair and a petrifying gaze wasn't cursed by Athena, but deliberately created by the imprisoned Titans as the ultimate act of rebellion against Olympus? In 2021, marine archaeologists discovered something impossible in the depths of the Mediterranean. A temple, older than any Greek structure on record, carved into an underwater cliff face. And inside that temple, they found tablets. Tablets that tell a version of Medusa's story that's been buried for 3,000 years. A story about how the defeated Titans reached out from their prison in Tartarus and turned a mortal woman into a weapon so powerful that the gods themselves feared to face her directly. This is that story. Let's start with what you think you know. Medusa was one of 3 Gorgon sisters. She was beautiful once, a priestess of Athena. Poseidon violated her in Athena's temple. Athena, enraged by the desecration of her sacred space, punished Medusa by transforming her into a monster. Snakes for hair, bronze hands, a gaze that turned anyone who looked at her to stone. Eventually, the hero Perseus killed her, cut off her head, and gave it to Athena, who placed it on her shield. A tragic tale of a woman victimized twice, first by a god, then by a goddess. A story of injustice, cruelty, and the powerlessness of mortals in the face of divine politics. That's the version that survived. That's the version the gods wanted you to believe. But those tablets tell a different story. According to the inscriptions, Medusa wasn't transformed by Athena at all. She was chosen. Carefully selected by forces far older and far more dangerous than the Olympian gods. The Titans. You remember the Titans, right? The primordial deities who ruled before Zeus and his siblings staged their coup. Kronos, who ate his own children to prevent them from overthrowing him. Oceanus, the living embodiment of the world's waters. Hyperion, the Titan of light. Iapetus, Themis, Rhea. Beings of immense power, intimately connected to the fundamental forces of existence. They ruled for eons until Zeus, aided by his siblings and the Cyclopes and Hecatoncheires, waged a 10-year war against them. The Titanomachy, the war that shook the foundations of reality. Zeus won, the Titans lost, and the losers were thrown into Tartarus, the deepest pit of the underworld, a prison from which there was supposedly no escape. Chains forged by the gods themselves, guards posted at every possible exit. The Titans were locked away, their reign ended, their power broken. Or so the Olympians believed. But here's what the gods didn't understand. The Titans weren't like them. The Olympians were powerful, yes, but they were essentially very powerful people. Anthropomorphic, human-like, with human-like motivations, human-like emotions, human-like limitations. The Titans were different. They were older. They were primal. They weren't representations of natural forces. They were those forces. You couldn't truly separate Oceanus from the ocean. You couldn't completely sever Hyperion from light itself. The Titans were bound, yes. Imprisoned, yes. But not powerless. Implicit. Tartarus, in the absolute darkness and isolation of their prison, the Titans began to plan. Not an escape, they weren't naive enough to think they could break Zeus's chains directly. But revenge. A way to strike back at the gods who had overthrown them. A way to undermine Olympus from within. They needed a weapon, not an army. Zeus had already proven he could defeat armies. Not another Titan, they were all imprisoned. They needed something the Olympians wouldn't see coming. Something that could exist in the world above while being controlled from Tartarus. Something that could threaten the gods without the gods being able to trace it back to its source. They needed a mortal weapon. Someone human enough to move freely in the mortal world. Someone touched by divine power but not bound by divine law. Someone who could kill gods. Classics began to reach out. Not physically, they couldn't do that from Tartarus. But the bars of their prison couldn't contain consciousness, couldn't contain dreams, couldn't contain influence. They sent whispers into the world above. subtle manipulations, small nudges to causality. They were looking for the right person, the perfect candidate for their weapon. And they found her in Athens, a young woman named Medusa. Beautiful, yes, but that's not why they chose her. Intelligent, devoted, disciplined. A priestess of Athena who took her vows seriously. A woman with integrity in a world that offered her very little protection. A woman who, most importantly, had already caught the attention of Poseidon. Now let's talk about Poseidon for a moment. Poseidon, god of the seas, earthshaker, stormbringer. One of the three brothers who divided the cosmos between them after defeating the Titans. Zeus got the sky, Hades got the underworld, and Poseidon got the oceans. But Poseidon always felt he got the short end of that deal. He resented Zeus's authority. He chafed under the new order, and the Titans knew this. They knew Poseidon's resentment. They knew his pride. They knew he could be manipulated. So they whispered to him, planted thoughts, inflamed desires, made him notice Medusa in ways he might not have on his own. They didn't force him. The Titans weren't strong enough for that from their prison. But they influenced. They suggested. They guided. And Poseidon, god of the seas, entered Athena's temple. He saw Medusa there, this beautiful priestess, and he wanted her. What happened next, the tablets are clear about this, wasn't seduction. It was violence. Poseidon took what he wanted because he was a god, and she was mortal, and in his mind, that meant he could. Medusa prayed to Athena, begged for protection, begged for intervention. But Athena didn't come. Couldn't come, actually, because she was in Olympus at a gathering of the gods that she couldn't leave without raising suspicion. The Titans had planned that too. They'd manipulated events to ensure Athena would be absent at the crucial moment. When Athena finally returned to her temple and found Medusa there, traumatized, violated, her sacred space desecrated, she was furious. But not at Poseidon. She was angry at Medusa. Now, you might think that's cruel, victim-blaming at its most divine, and you'd be right, but that's not the whole story. Athena knew something was wrong. She's the goddess of wisdom, after all. She could sense manipulation, could feel the fingerprints of foreign influence all over this situation. She knew the Titans were involved somehow, but she didn't know how, and she didn't know why. What she did know was that Medusa had been touched by something ancient and dangerous, that she'd become a nexus point for forces that shouldn't be active in the mortal world. Athena had a choice. She could try to heal Medusa, try to undo whatever the Titans had started, but that would take time, investigation, unraveling complex divine manipulation. And during that time, the Titans could complete their work. Or she could act decisively, contain the threat, transform Medusa into something that couldn't be easily used against Olympus. Athena chose containment. She cursed Medusa, or that's what it looked like. What she actually did was try to seal away whatever the Titans had planted in this mortal woman. She transformed Medusa's beauty into monstrousness, hoping that isolation would keep her safe from further manipulation. She gave her the petrifying gaze, hoping that it would protect Medusa by keeping everyone, including other gods, at a distance. Athena thought she was preventing the Titans from completing their weapon. But she was wrong. She'd just finished building it for them, because the transformation, the curse, the power to turn living beings to stone, that was exactly what the Titans needed. They'd wanted Medusa to be transformed. They'd orchestrated the entire chain of events specifically to make Athena curse her. Here's why. The Titans couldn't directly harm the Olympian gods from Tartarus. Divine law prevented it. The chains that bound them were forged specifically to stop them from using their power against Zeus and his siblings. But Medusa wasn't a Titan. She was mortal. Changed, yes. Powerful, yes. But fundamentally still human. And divine law didn't prevent mortals from harming gods. The Titans had just found a loophole. They'd created a mortal weapon, blessed by an Olympian goddess herself, that could threaten the gods. And the best part? The gods didn't even realize they'd been played. Athena thought she'd contained a threat. The other gods thought Medusa was just another monster. a tragic casualty of divine politics. Nobody understood that the Titans had just armed a weapon aimed directly at Olympus. Now, you're probably wondering how the Titans could control Medusa from their prison, how they could guide this weapon they'd created. The answer is in the serpents. The snakes that replaced Medusa's hair weren't just for show. They were conduits, direct connections to Tartarus. Each serpent was a line of communication, a channel through which the Titans could whisper, suggest, influence. They couldn't control Medusa completely. She still had free will, still had agency. But they could speak to her. They could show her visions. They could offer knowledge. And most importantly, they could give her a purpose. Because Medusa was suffering, isolated on an island, transformed into a monster, abandoned by the goddess she'd served faithfully. She was angry. She was hurt. She was looking for meaning in her transformed existence. And the Titans gave her one. Themselves. They told her the truth. Or at least, their version of it. They told her how the gods had used her, how Athena had cared more about her temple's sanctity than about protecting her priestess, how Poseidon faced no consequences for his violence, how the entire divine order was built on the suffering of those with less power. They told her about the old ways, when the Titans ruled. They painted themselves as victims, overthrown by ungrateful children who lacked wisdom and restraint. They offered her alliance, not servitude. They were too clever for that. Alliance, partnership, a chance to strike back at the gods who had failed her, a chance to matter, to have power, to be more than just a victim or a monster. Medusa listened. What else did she have? She was alone, transformed, feared. The Titans were the only voices offering her anything other than isolation and death. She accepted their offer. And that's when the real plan began. The Titans didn't want Medusa to randomly petrify sailors and adventurers who stumbled onto her island. That was pointless. What they wanted was much more strategic. They wanted her to target specific individuals, people who were important to the gods, heroes, demigods, mortals who the Olympians had invested in. The Titans fed Medusa information through the serpents. They told her when certain heroes would be passing near her island. They showed her visions of these heroes' connections to the gods. And Medusa, using her new powers, would lure them close. Some she killed, some she petrified. Some she simply terrified so badly that they abandoned their quests and returned home broken. The gods started to notice. Their champions were disappearing or failing at unprecedented rates. Heroes who should have succeeded in their tasks were returning traumatized, or not returning at all. The pattern was centered around the Aegean Sea, around the area where Medusa's island was located. But the gods couldn't figure out why. They knew about Medusa, obviously, but they thought she was just a monster. Dangerous, yes, but isolated, not actively targeting their interests. It took them years to realize they were under attack, and by the time they figured it out, Medusa had already accomplished significant damage to Olympus's influence in the mortal world. But the Titans weren't satisfied with just disrupting divine plans in the mortal realm. They wanted to strike directly at Olympus itself. And they'd built Medusa's power specifically for that purpose. The petrifying gaze wasn't just a weapon against mortals. It could work on immortals too. The gods didn't know this because none of them had been foolish enough to look Medusa directly in the eyes. They approached her with mirrors, with indirect viewing, always careful. But the Titans knew the truth. Medusa's gaze could turn a god to stone. Not permanently, they were immortal after all, but for long enough to trap them, long enough to humiliate them, long enough to prove that the Olympians weren't as untouchable as they pretended. The Titans planned to have Medusa lure an Olympian god to her island. Not one of the major ones, that would be too difficult, but a minor deity. Someone important enough that their petrification would send shockwaves through Olympus. They chose carefully. They needed a god who was vain enough to be manipulated, curious enough to investigate personally rather than sending servants, isolated enough that their disappearance wouldn't be immediately noticed. They selected Ares, god of war, impulsive, aggressive, constantly trying to prove himself to Zeus. The Titans used Medusa to start rumors, whispers that reached Ares's ears, tales of a warrior on a remote island who claimed to be stronger than the god of war himself, a fighter who could defeat anyone, even an Olympian. Ares's pride was wounded. He decided to investigate personally. He arrived at Medusa's island, ready for a fight, and Medusa gave him one. But not the fight he expected. She didn't meet him with weapons or physical combat. She simply looked at him. Direct eye contact. God to monster, or monster to God. The hierarchy wasn't clear anymore. Ares felt his body seizing, felt his divine essence struggling against a power it wasn't designed to resist. He was turning to stone. Slowly, but inevitably. He panicked, manifested his divine power, trying to break free. And he succeeded. Barely. He tore himself away from Medusa's gaze before the petrification completed. But not before she'd proven her point. She could hurt gods. She could threaten Olympus itself. Ares fled. He returned to Olympus, humiliated, partially petrified, his arm still locked in stone up to the elbow. It took Hephaestus 3 days to carefully chip away the stone without damaging the divine flesh beneath. The gods were terrified. Not publicly, of course. They couldn't show fear. But privately, in the halls of Olympus, panic spread. If Medusa could do that to Ares, she could do it to any of them. She could potentially even threaten Zeus himself. Medusa wasn't just a monster anymore. She was an existential threat to the divine order. The gods convened in emergency council. They needed to eliminate Medusa. But none of them wanted to face her directly. Whoever killed her would have to look at her, and that meant risking petrification. They needed a proxy, a mortal champion. Someone expendable who could do the job without putting divine lives at risk. They needed Perseus. Now, the traditional story tells us that Perseus ended up on his quest to kill Medusa through a series of unfortunate events. King Polydectes wanted to marry Perseus's mother, wanted Perseus out of the way, so he sent him on an impossible quest. That's the surface story. But if you dig deeper, you find something interesting. Polydectes was visited by a stranger just before he announced the quest, a mysterious figure who suggested the idea of demanding Medusa's head, who planted the seed. The Olympian gods were manipulating events just as the Titans had. They guided Perseus toward Medusa. They gave him divine gifts to ensure his success. Athena's polished shield to view Medusa indirectly. Hermes's winged sandals for speed. Hades's helm of invisibility. A sword sharp enough to cut through anything. They armed him with everything he needed, but they told him nothing about why Medusa was dangerous. Nothing about the Titans. Nothing about the larger conflict he was being drawn into. Perseus was a weapon, just like Medusa. The difference was that Perseus didn't know it. He thought he was a hero on a quest. Medusa knew she was a weapon. The Titans had been honest with her about that much. When Perseus arrived at her island, Medusa knew he was coming. The serpents had whispered warnings. The Titans had shown her visions of the young hero approaching, and they gave her a choice. She could kill him easily. He was skilled, yes, but she'd faced and defeated warriors far more experienced. She could turn him to stone the moment he entered her line of sight. Or she could let him win. The Titans explained their reasoning. If Medusa killed Perseus, another hero would come, and another, and another. The gods wouldn't stop until she was dead. But if Perseus succeeded, if he killed her, her head would be taken to Olympus, and that head would retain its power. The petrifying gaze would remain active even after death. The Titans had built her that way. Medusa dead and on Athena's shield was potentially more dangerous than Medusa alive and isolated on her island. Because on Athena's shield, Medusa's head would be in the heart of Olympus, close to the gods themselves. A weapon waiting to be activated. Bathrooms promised Medusa that her death wouldn't be the end, that they would find a way to use her even after Perseus struck her down, that her sacrifice would be the final blow against the gods who had wronged her. Medusa believed them, or maybe she was just tired. Tired of isolation. Tired of being a monster. Tired of living as a weapon in someone else's war. Either way, she made her choice. When Perseus crept into her cave, when he approached with his shield mirror, when he raised his sword, Medusa pretended to be asleep. She could have woken, could have fought, could have survived, but she stayed still. She let him strike. She let him sever her head from her body. And from the blood that spilled from her neck, two creatures were born: Pegasus, the winged horse, and Chrysaor, the warrior with the golden sword. Born from her union with Poseidon, offspring that emerged only at her death. But the tablets tell a different story. Pegasus and Chrysaor weren't children. They were contingencies, final weapons the Titans had hidden inside Medusa's blood, waiting to be released. Pegasus was designed to spread chaos in the mortal world, a flying horse that couldn't be tamed, that would disrupt established order wherever it went. Chrysaor was meant to hunt gods, a warrior whose golden sword could harm immortals. Both were meant to continue the Titans' work after Medusa was gone. But the gods moved quickly. They captured both creatures before they could fulfill their purpose. Pegasus was eventually tamed by Bellerophon with Athena's help. Chrysaor's fate is less clear in the myths, which probably means the gods dealt with him quietly. And head was taken to Athena. The goddess placed it on her shield, the aegis, where it remains in all the classic depictions. A trophy, a warning, a symbol of divine victory over monstrousness, but also something else, a bomb that never detonated. Because the Titans had been right about one thing. The head retained its power. It could still petrify. It could still threaten gods. Athena kept it close, thinking she was controlling a dangerous artifact, not realizing she was carrying a weapon that could potentially be turned against her. The Titans' plan had almost worked. They'd created a mortal weapon that had threatened Olympus, killed or traumatized dozens of heroes, actually harmed a god, and ended up positioned in the heart of divine power as a potential future threat. The only thing that stopped the plan from succeeding completely was that the Titans couldn't activate Medusa's head remotely. The serpents were dead. The connection was severed. The head was still dangerous, but it was passive. It only worked if someone looked directly at it. The gods made sure nobody did. They were careful. They were paranoid. They'd learned their lesson. But here's the thing about the Titans. They're patient. They think in terms of eons, not years. They'd planted a weapon in Olympus. They could wait for the right moment to use it. Except that moment never came. The age of gods ended. The myths became stories. Olympus faded from active influence in the mortal world. And Medusa's head, still on Athena's shield in whatever realm the gods retreated to, remained dormant. A weapon that never fulfilled its ultimate purpose. But the Titans are still in Tartarus, still imprisoned, still planning. And somewhere in the back of all our minds, in the collective unconscious where myths live, Medusa's story persists. Not as the gods wanted it told, as a cautionary tale about divine punishment, but as something more complex, a story about being used, about being transformed into a weapon, about fighting back against powers that see you as expendable. The tablets found in that underwater temple, they don't just tell us about Medusa. They tell us about how easily we're all manipulated by larger forces, how often we're weapons in conflicts we don't understand, how the powerful use the powerless to fight their battles. Medusa was used by the Titans. Perseus was used by the gods. Both of them were weapons. The difference was awareness. And maybe that's the real lesson here. Not that the Titans were evil or that the gods were righteous. Both sides were willing to sacrifice mortals for their own purposes. Both sides saw humans as tools. The Titans were just more honest about it. They told Medusa what she was. They gave her choice within her limited options. They treated her as an ally rather than a servant. The gods pretended Perseus was a hero when he was really just a convenient solution to their problem. They elevated him after his victory, but they would have abandoned him just as easily if he'd failed. So who were the villains in this story? The Titans who created a weapon? The gods who destroyed it? Poseidon who violated Medusa in the first place? Athena who transformed her? Perseus who killed her? Or is it the system itself, the cosmic order that treats mortals as expendable pieces in divine chess games? Undermined. Themselves. Tablets don't answer that question. They just present the facts as the ancient priests understood them. Facts that the Olympian gods worked very hard to bury, because the truth made them look bad, made them look scared, made them look like they'd nearly lost control of the cosmos they claimed to rule. The Titans used Medusa to defy the gods, and it almost worked. If Medusa had been just a little more ruthless, if she'd killed Perseus instead of letting him succeed, the Titans might have had more time to develop additional weapons. If Pegasus and Chrysaor had escaped instead of being captured, they might have caused enough chaos to weaken Olympus significantly. If the head on Athena's shield had somehow been activated, it could have petrified multiple gods at once. Any of those scenarios could have changed the balance of power, could have given the Titans the opening they needed to escape Tartarus, or at least to make the gods' rule unstable enough to be challenged. Emis Mood. But it didn't happen. The gods won. The Titans remained imprisoned. And Medusa became a story, a myth, a symbol that means different things to different people. Monster, victim, weapon, rebel. All of those and none of those. She was a woman who was touched by forces beyond her understanding, transformed against her will, given terrible power, and then used by both sides in a conflict that wasn't hers. She made choices with the options available to her. She allied with the Titans because they were the only ones offering her anything. She accepted her death because she was tired of living as a weapon. And in the end, she failed. The Titans weren't freed. The gods weren't overthrown. Nothing fundamentally changed, except that for a brief moment, the Olympian gods were genuinely afraid, genuinely threatened, genuinely aware that they weren't as secure in their power as they believed. That's what the Titans accomplished with Medusa, not victory, but doubt. They proved that the gods could be hurt, that mortals, properly weaponized, could threaten immortals, that Olympus wasn't unassailable. And maybe that was enough. Maybe the goal wasn't to win, but just to make the gods know they were in a fight, to deny them the comfort of absolute power, to ensure they could never feel completely safe. If that was the goal, it worked. After Medusa, the gods were more cautious, more paranoid, more aware that there were forces, even imprisoned forces, that could still hurt them. They stopped being so casual about their interventions in the mortal world. They started treating threats more seriously. They never underestimated the Titans again. So in a way, Medusa succeeded. Not in the way the Titans wanted, not in the way she might have wanted if she'd had other options, but she made an impact. She changed the dynamic. She proved that weapons can cut both ways. And that legacy, That's what persists in the myth. Not the surface story about a monster and a hero, but the deeper truth about power, manipulation, sacrifice, and the cost of being used by forces greater than yourself. The Titans used Medusa to defy the gods. She paid the price. But the gods paid a price too. They paid in fear, in uncertainty, in the knowledge that they could be hurt. And they paid in history, because they had to bury the truth, had to rewrite the story, had to pretend that Medusa was just a random monster rather than a calculated weapon in a larger conflict. The fact that they felt the need to hide the truth tells you how dangerous that truth was, how much it threatened their image, how much it revealed about their vulnerabilities. The tablets are being studied now, translated, analyzed, debated. Some scholars say they're authentic. Others say they're later fabrications. Still others say it doesn't matter, because myths aren't about literal truth anyway. But here's what I think. I think the story on those tablets is true. Not necessarily in a literal historical sense, but true in the way myths are true. True about power dynamics. True about how the powerful use the powerless. True about how conflicts between great forces always end up hurting those caught in the middle. True about how history is written by victors who have every reason to lie. Medusa's story, the real story, isn't about a woman being punished for being beautiful. It's about a woman being turned into a weapon by imprisoned titans desperate to strike back at the gods who had overthrown them. It's about divine politics and ancient grudges and the price that mortals pay when they get caught in the crossfire. It's about how the titans used her to defy the gods, and how the gods responded by using Perseus to eliminate the threat, and how both sides saw Medusa as nothing more than a tool to be used and discarded. That's the truth those tablets tell. And that truth is worth knowing, because we're all weapons sometimes. We're all used by forces larger than ourselves. Corporations, governments, ideologies, movements. We're all Perseus thinking we're heroes when we're actually just convenient solutions to someone else's problem. And we're all Medusa sometimes too, transformed by circumstances beyond our control, given power we didn't ask for, expected to fight battles that aren't ours, used and discarded when we're no longer useful. The myth isn't ancient history. It's now. It's always. It's the eternal truth about power and how it treats people who have less of it. The Titans used Medusa to defy the gods, and in doing so, they wrote a story that echoes through every age. A story about resistance, about fighting back even when you know you'll lose, about making the powerful afraid even if you can't defeat them, about being a weapon that still has enough consciousness to choose how you're used. That's Medusa's legacy. Not the petrification, not the snakes, not the death, but the defiance, the refusal to be quietly victimized, the decision to matter, even if mattering means becoming a monster. The Titans knew what they were doing when they chose her. They knew she had that strength, that refusal to submit, that core of resistance that could be shaped into a weapon. They didn't make her a monster. They gave her the power to become one, and she chose to embrace it, to use it, to make the gods pay attention. That choice, that's what makes her story worth telling, worth remembering, worth discovering in tablets beneath the Mediterranean. The Titans used her, but she used them right back. She got power from the bargain. She got purpose. She got revenge, even if incomplete. She got to matter in a way that a powerless, violated priestess never could have. Was it worth it? Was becoming a weapon, being remembered as a monster, dying on a random island worth whatever she gained? I don't know. I don't think we can judge that from outside her experience. But I think she made her choice with open eyes. And I think the Titans respected her for it, in their own alien way. They used her, yes, but they also empowered her. They also gave her the ability to defy the gods who had failed her. And that gift, that terrible gift, that's how the Titans used Medusa to defy the gods, by turning their victim into their enemy, by weaponizing their cruelty, by making their own actions come back to haunt them. Medusa was the bill come due. The consequences made flesh. The price of divine carelessness. And for a brief, shining, terrible moment, she made Olympus tremble. That's how the Titans used her to defy the gods. That's the story the tablets tell. That's the truth that was buried. And now you know it too.